A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. Jay Costa, the Weekly Standard. He's the author on the line right now. Jay, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for taking time out of your day for us. So, being from Illinois, corruption, we're kind of taught that along with the alphabet. Is that not such a good thing after all?
No, well, Illinois is certainly a special case out of the 50 states, maybe right up there with the state of New York. But no, it's a nationwide problem as well.
Now, when we think of political corruption, I think many of us have visions of what William Jefferson down in Louisiana, the cash inside the freezer, the payoffs and the rip-offs and the things like that. But it takes many different forms, and I think that's what you talk a lot about in the book. There's a lot of corruption that might not meet the, dictionary definition of corruption, but is still quite worrisome.
That's right. Usually we think of corruption as kickbacks, extortion, or bribery. But, the founding fathers, James Madison in particular, would have had a much broader definition of it. Corruption of what's a republic? We're supposed to be a republic. A republic is a government that works for the interests of everybody. So a political corruption of a republic happens when the government favors a few at the expense of everybody else. And the argument I make in my book is that as the government has grown larger and larger, it's actually become more and more corrupt. It has a greater tendency to favor special interests, narrow factions over the public good.
You got a great quote in here. What did we have originally when the Constitution was written? They asked Benjamin Franklin, "What have you given us?" He said, "We've given you a republic if you can keep it." Now you go on to write, "Well, we didn't keep it. We've got a special interest democracy."
That's right. And, what's happened over the generations since the Constitution, when the Constitution was ratified in 1789, it had a very limited vision of federal power. Very limited. Compared to what the federal government does today, and you could really say it's shockingly limited. And over the generations, we've expanded federal power, and we did so in a way that we grew the size and scope of the government beyond what our institutions of government, the Congress, the presidency, the courts, the bureaucracy, we've grown it beyond their capacity to handle power responsibly. They exercise their vast powers irresponsibly, and as I argue in the book, they favor interest groups, special interests, people who have money, who can donate to political campaigns, who can spend millions of dollars on lobbying, who can offer politicians and bureaucrats and staffers cushy jobs for when they leave the government. And if you look policy after policy that comes out of Washington, D.C., when you peel back the layers of it, you see more and more cronyism embedded in our legislation.
Jay Cost with us from the Weekly Standard and the new book, A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. It's Riley and Scott here on WROK. We had you on to talk about your last book, Spoiled Rotten, how the politics of patronage corrupted the once noble Democratic Party and now threatens the American Republic. And it sounds like this book, and it reads like a kind of a continuation of that argument. The special interests, the patronage, the favors, that in your last book, the Democrats have been forced to promise because this collection of special interests is largely what makes up the party these days, has been taken to a federal level and a governmental level on the national stage.
That's right. One of the most interesting criticisms or pushbacks I got from writing Spoiled Rotten, people would say, well, what about the Republicans? And, I didn't set out to write a story about the Republican Party. I wanted to write a story about the Democratic Party. But, I got to thinking after I finished with that book, that's a pretty good point. So let's take a look at political corruption more broadly. And in fact, when I look at contemporary policy in the book, in the second half of the book, I look at farm subsidies, I look at the pork barrel, I look at Medicare, regulations, and corporate taxes. Honestly, the Republican Party's hands are as dirty as the Democratic Party.
And, looking at your description of what was intended and what we now have, you also highlight that this is not what people were looking for. All the openness of our system of government today, confidence in it is at an all-time low.
Right. It's really extraordinary when you think about it. In the last 50 years, we have had voting rights and civil rights for African Americans. We've had an extraordinary increase in the number of people who can participate in the process. People who are 18 to 21 can now vote. In the last 100 years, we've had the direct election of senators. Presidential campaigns are as competitive as ever. We are awash in democracy, and yet people have as little faith as ever in our democratic institutions. And I think the reason is that we don't get to vote for what constitutes the public good anymore. That's not what our votes mean. Instead, our votes are just sort of a foundation for, a pretty sizable, extensive network of cronyism and what I would call corruption, influence peddling.
Jay Cost with us. The new book is on shelves right now. A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. Find it everywhere, Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and elsewhere. It's Riley and Scott here on WROK. In your conclusion, Jay, you write, ultimately the public is supposed to be the steward of the government, but how well can it perform the task when it no longer believes doing so is worth its while? How does a democratic government prosper over the long term if the citizenry does not trust the government to represent its interests? And that rolls back to a checks and balances. Certainly there's checks and balances built into the government, but ultimately the people, the public, hold people responsible if they see this type of corruption happening, but they don't trust that whomever they vote to replace the corrupt official is going to act any differently. And that's really toward the core of the problem, isn't it?
It really is. When the framers of the Constitution were designing the government, they founded everything. The foundational principle was what they called the Republican principle, the idea that the majority rules. And, political corruption really strikes at the heart of that, because what it does is it uses the resources that the majority give to the government, right? Because government is premised on the consent of the governed. The corruption uses the resources and the powers of the majority for the benefit of a few. And over time, how are most people supposed to look toward their government if they see that happening again and again and again, and they lose faith in the government, and they lose the will or the interest or the resolve to continue participating? In a democratic society such as ours that's supposed to be premised upon the consent of the governed, that is an extraordinarily dangerous development.
Yeah, because as you point out, people stop believing that the government is representing their interest, and the government in turn says, well, all right, we'll just operate on something other than consent. We'll just go ahead and do this.
That's right. What you can get, honestly, is a vicious cycle where corruption breeds corruption. That was what the founders of Madison and Jefferson were particularly worried about. They didn't see corruption as something that just happened. They saw it as something that if it's not actively being fought, it grows, it spreads, it gets worse over time. And frankly, I think if you look at a lot of contemporary public policies, that's exactly what you see. You see it with, for instance, look at Obamacare. Every group under the sun wanted a piece of that pie. And why? Mm-hmm. Why did they want such action? Because they had seen all of the benefits that could accrue if you got in on the game on a program like Medicare or the Medicare prescription drug program. The success of special interests in getting their action on those programs, it brought more people in. And the next time the government is looking to do something big and bold, some big social welfare initiative, you're going to see even more groups. It's a problem that if it's not actively being stopped, it spreads, it gets worse, it threatens the very foundations of our country.
Jay Cost with us from the Weekly Standard. His new book, A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. Jay, is it ultimately somewhat of a 10th Amendment question, too, wherein if we return some of the powers from Washington back to the states, somewhat closer to the people, politicians, representatives would be more responsive and perhaps a little more obvious when this sort of behavior is going on? Or will that just transfer the corruption from Washington back to the states?
Well, as you all well know, in the land of Lincoln in Illinois, state government is not necessarily responsive. But one of the advantages of the state government is that they don't have a monopoly over it. If your government is acting inappropriately, as if it's misbehaving, if your state or local government is misbehaving, you can move. Now, that's not to say it's easy to move. It's costly to move, but it is an option that you possess. And that's the difference with the federal government, is that they have a monopoly over all of us. There is no getting away from them. You can go to Illinois or Pennsylvania, you can go to Hawaii, you can go to Nome, Alaska, and you're still under their control.
And you point out as well, and I think this is a great way of looking at it, too, one of the earliest metaphors to define corruption. It's like cancer or wood rot. You know, okay, well, they're corrupt in this area, but it's just fine. It's confined to that area. Whoop, it metastasized into something else.
That's exactly right. And that's something we've seen again and again and again, as I point out in the book. You know, policies that start going awry tend to get worse over time. Farm subsidies is a classic example. Farm subsidies were implemented in the 1930s because of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains, and yet it transformed itself into a log roll that ensnares all of these interest groups, from wealthy farmers, agribusinesses, farm machinery equipment, even healthy food advocates, in this multi-billion-dollar log roll. And honestly, if you total up the total cost of farm subsidies since the 1930s, it comes out to be about $1 trillion. I mean, it's not something you think about. Oh, farm subsidies, who cares about that, right? I mean, most people aren't thinking about farm subsidies. But it's a way to reward special interest groups, and the price tag to the national wealth has been enormous, astronomical.
All right, Jay, so what do we do? I think I saw you tweet a week or two ago that the more you researched this book, the less you cared about who actually won, who was going to win in 2016, because things just keep rolling the way they are. What's the way to stop it?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the animating ideas behind that was, you know, I think one of our problems nowadays is we're too focused on parties, which is not to say parties aren't important. It's just to say that there are good Republicans and bad Republicans and good Democrats and bad Democrats. And I think what we need more than anything else is an honest-to-goodness reform movement. You know, one of the more heartening things I found when I was doing my research is that for all of the corruption in the 19th century, which has been remembered as a very corrupt time after the Civil War, there was always some active, energetic, engaged reform movement that was looking to put pressure on the government to mend its ways. Some of them had good ideas, some of them had bad ideas, some of them failed, but, you know, others succeeded and changed things for the better. And that, honestly, is something that I don't see nowadays. For all of our fights over should we have more government or should we have less government, I don't see a lot of concern about, okay, well, we all agree government should do these sets of things, so let's make sure it does them well. I don't really see a lot of that, and that, I think, is the critical ingredient.
Jay Cost, the new book, A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. You can find it at the Weekly Standard's website, in the print editions, too. And, Jay, are you back on Twitter for good? You disappear for, like, months at a time. I imagine researching and working a whole lot on this book. Are you back at Jay Cost TWS?
I am, yeah. You know, I have mixed emotions toward Twitter. It's like the playground in elementary school. You know, sometimes it's fun, and then sometimes the bully comes up and throws dirt in your face. But I'm back. I'm back now, yeah.
And just like the playground, Jay, a few cat pictures makes everything better.
Very well put, yes.